Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Byte-sized HR, powered by Lutuan. I'm your host, Loic, and today on this call, the co-host of this call and co-founder of Lutuan, Lukas Foglar.
Great to be here, and thanks for having me, Loic.
Glad to have you on this call. We've got quite a topic for you today, hyper-personalization of the employee experience. And for our audience, we're going to be looking into some key pillars, the why, the how, and the what when it comes to the implementation.
And who better to guide us through this topic than the very own Angela Cheng-Cimini, a Senior Vice President of Talent and Chief Human Resource Officer at Harvard Business Publishing.
Could not agree more. Well, without further ado, let's bring in our guest onto the call. Hello, Angela. Thank you very much for joining us on this podcast. So to kind of start it off, because hyper-personalization is something we had initially kind of discussed in the previous call. We've done some research on it, but for our audience, how would you define hyper-personalization in the context of employee experience?
It's actually quite simple. Like, it's meeting the employee where they are. So if you think about Amazon knows when you're running out of your favorite shampoo. Netflix will recommend movies that you want to watch and tee them up for you. Spotify will suggest new artists, right? They know things about us. They have data about us regarding our habits, who we hang out with, what we read. And employers are sitting on a gold mine of very, very similar data. So to that same extent, whereas they're building a customer journey, we should be building an employee journey that's data-driven, but also human-centric. And that's what hyper-personalization is all about.
It is extremely clear that this is an important topic. Why do you think that less than 10% of organizations use this method effectively, according to Applaud's 2021 findings?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are still a lot of organizations who are still struggling just to get what I call the peanut butter spread, right? They're still trying to get the employee experience at the most fundamental level, right? So hyper-personalization is the next evolution of that. So if you haven't quite yet defined your employee value proposition, if you don't have the basics down, if you don't have the right culture, if you're not providing the right experiences, if you're not paying correctly, right? If you haven't helped your folks figure out what are the important priorities they should be working on, then you can't even begin to talk about what kind of experience you're going to craft at the most micro levels.
It might seem quite obvious, and before we get into the essential steps that organizations can take in implementing hyper-personalized experiences, why is it important? Why should HR executives or business executives care in the first place?
So we've been hearing so much. Progressive leadership has been so much about empathy and compassion. Right. I mean, if you look back 10 years ago, that was not in the vocabulary. In fact, we put up very clear barriers, like leave your personal stuff at home. Don't bring that into work. We're just here to talk about the stuff that we pay you to do. And now those lines are so blurred. And in fact, there are increasing expectations that people bring their full selves to work and all the messiness that entails. And so if you want people to be fully engaged, that means you have to make space for all the things that may be competing for their time against doing work. And so for leaders to fully unlock the full value of that, they should care about the mental well-being, about the emotional state of their employees, about their full potential. And that looks different for every single person. So if you really want to release all the productivity that's locked up, then you have to get down to that level in the organization.
Okay, so if we have if we take as a fact that our listeners are mostly HR people within senior leadership or even junior HR folks, what are the first steps an organization should actually take to start using hyper-personalization in HR? Because they might not necessarily be that advanced. They might be at the very early beginnings, maybe even still kind of polishing their EVPs. Where can they start?
So again, I think back to my earlier point, first, assure that you do have a clear employee value proposition, right? You can't run before you've learned to walk. So again, make sure that all the foundational bits of your people strategy are in place, right? So there are table stakes, right? People are expecting a safe work environment, physically safe. They're expecting an environment that's free of abuse and harassment. They expect to make a living wage. So make sure that at least those things are covered. I mean, we say that a little bit flippantly, but there are still places where that's not true. Particularly those that are in manufacturing or hard labor, not office or knowledge workers, right? And not all of us work in posh office settings. Some of us have manufacturing, hard labor, right? So let's make sure that that is at least provided for. Once you can assure that you've done that, then you should start looking at things like your culture, your learning and development strategy, your pay programs, whether or not your managers are equipped to do those things. Look at your career progression, and then prioritize which of those is the one that you can address the most quickly and or is the highest burning platform. So for example, you may not be able to fix pay because it's too expensive. Okay, so maybe do that, sort of step by step incrementally. But in terms of equipping your managers, you can tackle that right away. You can start upskilling them and give them practice around emotional intelligence, which is one of the easiest ways to unlock an employee's potential.
Fair enough. And kind of like looking at it, because you mentioned your career path and so on, but if we look at it maybe from a technological point of view, what technologies today you would consider are crucial for enabling hyper-personalization? And maybe if there's any you can name as examples, that would be great.
So that is a really great question, because I think the answer is you don't need really sophisticated or expensive technology to do that, right? So I came from a startup that had 120 employees. I had a very, very small HR budget. And even now, working at a 600-person firm, I still have limited resources. And even those that are 100,000 doesn't mean you should be spending your budget dollars, without discretion. So the beauty of this is that the data you already have, things like where do they go to school? Do they have a family to take care of? What generation of the workforce are they in? When was the last time they had a promotion? What is their pay versus the market? These are pieces of data that we already have on our employees. It's really a matter of actually pulling it out and then doing some data analysis around gaps, around mobility, around satisfaction. This is all data that we already have, and you can do it on the back of a simple spreadsheet. Now, if you have AI embedded in your HRIS system, all the easier, right? Because it can put it into a pretty report for you. It can probably highlight red flags, but you don't need all the bells and whistles to start this work.
Okay. And kind of, sorry, go for it, Lukas.
No, I was actually wondering one thing to talk about when we start using data of our employees is, of course, data privacy and sort of, let's call them ethical boundaries. How do you think that people are actually comfortable with that? And of course, like taking into account regulations like GDPR and others in the US, how can companies actually manage this in order to, on one hand, manage expectations, but at the same time stay within the ethical boundaries of the personalization?
I think it's such a good question, because certainly we know that in the instance when your Facebook feed knows that you've been shopping for sofas, this is a real story, because I was shopping for sofas, that feels a little intrusive. That feels a little creepy, right? That there is some big brother watching over you. I think employees give us a little bit more grace. And I think, in fact, we probably disappoint them because they know we know these things. So they know that they haven't been promoted in 5 years. They know that we know that they've only been getting the cost of inflation increases year over year. And the fact that we don't do something with that, I think it's a disappointment. So if we were actually to find value in that data and say, hey, you know what? Let's put in a development plan, because I see that you're stagnating in career. Let's be proactive with those conversations instead of waiting for an employee to finally complain, or worst case, leave the organization because we didn't take the time to discover that for ourselves.
Do you see any changes in expectations with the new generations entering the workplace?
100%. So, for those who are entering the organization around the pandemic, right, there's now an expectation that they can work where they want, how they want, when they want. The sense of instant gratification, especially for those generations that are digital natives, right? They don't know what it means to go to a library and read an encyclopedia that's probably 15 or 20 years old, right? All the information they get, they expect to be true, and they expect to be instantaneous. So that what does that mean for how quickly they should get feedback, how quickly they should get promoted? It means their sense of patience is so much smaller, right? And their expectation finally of transparency is so different. I remember starting out 20 plus years ago, like I would never have gone up to the CEO and say, I want to understand why you made that decision. Never in 100 years would I be that brazen. And now, you know, you answer to me, I'm your employee. If I'm going to give you my time, then I need to know that what I'm doing is a value to me as well as to you. So help me explain, help me to understand why I'm being paid what I am, why I'm being asked to work on the things that I'm working, or why I'm not being asked to work on those things that are interesting. So there's this whole level of transparency in the decisions that leaders make that this generation feels they have an obligation to know.
But then there are multiple generations meeting at a single workplace, generations that have grown up or like developed their careers in a little bit different time. When we think about scale, like putting this whole thing in motion, managing so many diverse groups of people within the organization, how can an organization actually kickstart this transition? Because ultimately, you mentioned multiple times, it's about people, not necessarily technology. But imagine organizations that have tens of thousands of employees. Where can they start? Like, how do they work with their leaders and with the line management and all of the structures in order to put this in motion?
So you're right. I mean, we currently have 5 generations in the workplace, but that is really just a moment in time. In a matter of 5 to 7 years, I believe the data says, 3/4 of the workforce will be millennials and Gen Z. 3/4. So we are losing the oldest cohorts faster than we are replacing them. So that is also a challenge, right? In the US, but I do believe it applies globally, fewer children are being born, which means fewer are going to go to university, which means fewer are going to pursue the kinds of jobs that you and I currently occupy. There are fewer and fewer coming up behind us. So actually, I think we sometimes make too much of these generational differences, because I believe fundamentally that if you treat people properly, you incentivize them properly, you give them opportunities to be seen and felt and heard, it doesn't matter if they're 70 and it doesn't matter if they're 17. And I don't think you can go wrong. Yes, there are uniquenesses and nuances, but frankly, if we do those things, you'll have solved 90% of the engagement problem.
I love that. I love that. In terms of the specific steps, I'm going to be very stubborn here. So imagine I'm a CEO or an HRD of an organization that has 20,000 employees. And let's imagine we are working on our employer value proposition. We're moving in the right direction. And we say, hey, look, we want to make a change. Like, where do we start? What are the areas to look into? What are the key pillars of a hyper-personalized experience?
So I actually think that your middle management layer is the key to unlocking. So your middle managers are probably the most burnt out layer in any organization. They are both strategist and executioner, and they are also both player and coach, right? So they're responsible for interpreting the goals that are set at the highest levels of the organization, making it clear and obvious to their team, but they also have their own stuff to do, right? So strategist and executioner. Then they have their own list of to-dos, so they're the player, but then they also have to take care of all their teams, so they're also coach.
Yeah.
And to the extent that they are ill-equipped to do those things, your organization loses its cohesion and employees lose a sense of connection to the organization. So what we've actually done in the last year is we've launched what we call a Leader Accelerator program, which focuses on that middle management. It is a 4-month-long program that is a combination of both asynchronous and synchronous components. It is both facilitated and self-moderated. There is homework and there are case studies and there is a keystone. So we are really investing in that layer of management. What I'd like to see come first, and I haven't yet fully thought this through, is that oftentimes in the military, if you're going to become an officer, you need to go through a leadership boot camp to prove your mettle. And I think that organizations should do the same. So often we just anoint the strongest individual contributor and say, well, you must make for a good manager, when it requires a completely different skill set, right? Just because you're the top salesperson doesn't mean you can suddenly be the top sales leader. And so I would like to think about a way of how do we support people who are going into new managerial roles with the skills that are emotional intelligence, self-awareness, being able to give feedback, setting clear goals, holding folks accountable. How do you do that? That's a very different skill. So I think, Lukas, to your question, how do we start with hyper-personalization? We have to start with middle managers so that they can deliver those experiences. I believe it's, there's a very famous study, I think it's Deloitte, that says that managers account for 70% in the variance of the employee experience. So if there's one single bullet, it's how do you equip your managers?
No, I really love that answer. At the same time, the middle management squeeze is a thing. And on top of everything, they have to go through also what's going on the housing market. And many of the middle managers are in a certain population, I mean, certain generation, like, for example, millennials, that are somehow also at, I want to say, mid-career crisis sort of thing. So I can really imagine that this would be a great first step. And I believe that with that, we could potentially slowly wrap, because focusing on first one thing is how we actually started this evolution in organizations of hyper-personalized experience. And with that, we would love to thank you, Angela, for taking time today to join us at the Byte-sized HR podcast. Thank you, Loic.
Yeah, I cannot agree more. I wish we had a live audience, because Angela and I love the discussion you guys were having with Lukas as well. There's quite a few interesting topics that are correlated to discussions we've had before. Tech fatigue when it comes to Generation Z, it is something indirectly linked to that as well. Yeah. Leadership generation gap as well, understanding leadership manager. And I'm not saying this in terms of promotion. I'm saying that it really kind of looks at the aspect that there's so much key points, under points, if we may say, underscores, that contribute to hyper-personalization, right? And when you came down to the technology that you were mentioning as well, in terms of it comes down to kind of the data, I kind of wanted to better understand the way you were looking at it, and I guess I'll just finish it with that question. But it sounded to me a lot like when we were talking about technology, that we don't need to spend too much money on it, right? Just having something in the background that kind of automates certain steps to make things a bit easier while pulling out that data in a way that is relevant. Is that how I understood? Did I understand that correctly? Or
yes, you understood it perfectly, right? We have all this raw data, and we just haven't taken the time to synthesize it, make sense of it. But it is all right there for us.
Yeah, definitely. And I think there's plenty of technologies out there as well, including us at Ludo One. I mean, I'm not going to hide it. I have it right behind me, which is really there to kind of promote it and push it out and make it digestible data that is easy to understand for managers, which is ironic because at the end of the day, managers also need to be able to be evaluated in a way to better understand if indeed they could go through that military boot camp that you mentioned, which I love the idea, to be fair. I really like the connection there. But in all of that, thank you, both of you, for joining us on this Byte-sized HR podcast. Thank you very much, Angela, for your great answers on this topic, and we wish our audience a lovely day. Thank you very much, guys. Take care.
Thank you.